All right. We have a very special episode today on the Energetic Principles podcast. We have Samuel F. Reynolds with us here today. Thanks for joining me, Sam.
Thank you for having me.
So I've been wanting to have Sam on my podcast for quite some time. I've attended a few of your lectures in past conferences. Actually, one in particular sticks out to me, and that was NORWAC in 2019, I believe it was the year I turned 40, and you just happened to be giving a talk on the midlife transits.
It's true. Yeah.
You you really helped me that day, Sam.
Oh, good. Well, yeah. I mean, my plan is to resume those set of lectures because I did 20s, 30s, 40s, and I'm 55 now, so I'm not going to comment on the 50s until I'm toward the end or beyond them. I think that's only fair.
I think that's a wise move. That's a wise move. I respect you for that because I remember you said that in the actual lecture. You're like, I'm just waiting to the 50s because you got to live it. I mean, what do you know until you get there, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So, but you definitely shared some things that day, along with other work that I've seen you do. But I share that with in my consultations. I'm like, and like Sam said, this blah blah blah. I always say the 20s is the shoulds, and the 30s is the wants, and the 40s is the musts.
You got it. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what you must do when you feel like, all right, I gotta make it or break it. And it was during my 40s that a lot of other things came together. I think that solidified my career in astrology. It also solidified, I got married in my 40s, which was, late for well, for a man usually, but yeah. For a person, but yeah, it was
I
a big decade.
I feel you. I kind of feel like it's turning out to be that way for me too. So that was sort of I wouldn't say my introduction to Sam, but my solidification of like, yes, I love what this man's talking about here. So
Oh, thank you.
so in case you have not heard of him before, Sam, will you share a little bit about yourself before we get started with our
Absolutely.
program?
So, I mean, especially what's relevant to astrology is I got into astrology trying to disprove it. For whatever reason, other than more than any other Hermetic art like tarot, numerology, because I started off with numerology, I hated astrology. Astrology really bothered me. I think it was because I couldn't understand how it worked, and more important, I'm born November 22nd. Yes, Scorpio. So, but what's funny is I um I always thought I was more the centaur than the arachnid. So I was like, well, clearly I'm a centaur. I mean, I like some sense of adventure, the travel and the dime. I'm smart, all these other things that supposedly, for Sagittarius. And I had a friend, Gemini. Well, she was a little more than a friend. She was a crush, but she was wise enough and old enough. She was much older than I was, maybe at that time, probably by 20 years or so, not to kind of like indulge me that way, but she really befriended me. And she was like, no, no, I think you're the bug. You're a Scorpio. And I was like, oh, no, no, no. And I just happened, without going too long into it, to meet an astrologer. And he asked if I had had a reading. And I was like, no. And I was like, well, let's see what kind of bunk this is. And I mean, the first 15 minutes, I did think it was bunk, including him saying, like, well, you're a sun in Scorpio. And I was like, that's bullshit. Can't be true. Um, but I was. And then he went on about, some other elements in my chart. And the thing that really hooked me is he started talking about some family dynamics that went beyond the pale of guesswork.
Mm.
And that really, proved I was a Scorpio because I was like, how do you know that? He's like, oh, it's right here. And he got all avuncular and like, so your Mercury here, and you're it's like, none of this makes sense. And so I decided to, because I wasn't academic, I was getting my master's and PhD in African American studies. I decided to study it for myself. And got some books and started doing some studies, and then going through life changes. I was at my Jupiter return, my second Jupiter return, going toward my eventually my Saturn return, and going through different career shifts. I left the academy, went into theater, and the arts, which is relevant because we're going to talk about that. Um, and then, but astrology was still there as I was kicking the can and trying to kick its teeth out. And eventually I realized I really liked astrology, decided to study it formally, especially when I moved to New York, became an astrologer, and here I am roughly 30 years later, being a teacher and practitioner of astrology.
I love it. I love it. You know, that's a it the skepticism is such an interesting thing. I mean, I think that comes naturally with some Scorpio energy, right? You want to see behind it. How could this be real? I was a skeptic too of many things. Maybe not of astrology. I think I always kind of there with astrology, but just a skeptic in general, especially with more spiritual based things. So I get it, but it's like once you get in there, that's why it's so hard sometimes with skepticism when people that take those positions, especially if you've been in it and you've studied it and you've watched the cycles, and, you know, like bless your friend who kind of took you through, you know, those moments to kind of guide you into what would then become, you know, obviously such a big part of your life.
Well, she
But
didn't guide me. I think she was just the opening. I mean,
like a catalyst, you know,
catalyst. She
the
was definitely a
catalyst.
catalyst.
There's oh man, my brain my brain just went like this. I'm just FYI to all you listeners out there, if you listen to the last episode, I was sick in that episode and I'm recovering from another illness today. So if my mind goes bloop on my thought, it's because I got sick brain over here. But anyways, what I'm trying to say about skepticism is that it's just so interesting when people are really skeptical about something, especially if you're on the other side of it and you know that it works and you've had time with it, because you're like, wait, you're skeptical of something, but you haven't put the time or effort to really go down it and to fully understand it and to really be able to have like a solid skepticism because you've studied it and it doesn't pan out.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean
So
that's true of most skeptics I find, especially online.
mm,
And I think that's the sorrowful aspect of skepticism, that they don't even ask basic questions. You know, one thing I think, I hope I don't sound self-congratulatory with it, but one thing I think I did right was I researched it, even though I thought it was bunk. I kept looking at it. And I think what prepared me was African American studies. You're like, aha, what do you mean? Well, because you just can't take anyone's story, and especially things that are called science, right at face value. You know, some people are skeptical of astrology because, like, well, science says, but have you read the science yourself? Have you studied astrology yourself? Um, and a lot of times they cite papers that they barely read, or many of the papers are not that very thorough. They think like, well, yeah, I debunked the horoscopes. What horoscopes? You mean like 12 signs for 12 people? That's not astrology. That's pop culture. That's a newspaper trying to sell newspapers. Astrologers trying to sell our wares. You know, at this particular point, I would say, Melissa, I'm more skeptical of astrologers than astrology.
mm, so
Yeah.
much to say on that.
If
But
you want to talk about that, we can go down that rabbit hole. I mean, like, that's pretty easy. I mean, interesting. I know we're here to talk about Saturn and Pisces, but I think it's all of one piece in some ways.
yeah, I was just about to say, I'm kind of fleshing it out.
Well,
Which is interesting to think about, just having Saturn going into Pisces and having had all this time and emphasis on Neptune being there and then Jupiter before, and just the rise of the current, boom in astrology and other such related, spiritual um interests and and what have you, and how many people have now taken part of it and the culture that has been, developed around it. And even when you think about Instagram and having, I'm sure you've dealt with, like I have, like imposters coming in and saying you're this, that, and the other. And those aren't necessarily astrologers. I mean, that's a whole thing in itself. But I feel like Saturn, right? Saturn is a sense of authority or structure or order. And so this is that peace that's coming in after all, Jupiter's been there, Neptune's ramped it up. It all started, not all started, but there's a big influx when Jupiter was in Scorpio and trining all that Neptune and that whole rise through that piece. And so
What do you mean
I
by
haven't
that?
really thought
In terms
about
of
it,
Jupiter
but
and
yeah.
Scorpio. What about with Jupiter and Scorpio? I want to follow you there in terms
Well,
of
just
piece.
well, Jupiter and Scorpio. And I remember actually Tony Howard and I talking about this, I think back in like 2018 or 2019 or something like that, about the influx of just astrologers and interest in astrology coming on the scene ever since Jupiter in Scorpio kind of trine that Neptune energy. And then, of course, Jupiter in Sag kind of ramped that up even more. And then we go into this whole period and then etc. That was just basically kind of my thought there, and thinking about how there hasn't been any sort of, not any sort of, but I feel like, and I haven't even thought about this before, just coming to me now, like a Saturn kind of playing a check on that, not a check on that, but like weeding it out a little bit more, going into Pisces, where there's just been a boom and no accountability, or as much structure, if that makes any sense at all.
No, it makes sense. I think Saturn, it's a more of a formalization that may come about, especially when Saturn moves into a Jupiter sign. I mean, we've seen, in 2016, 2015, there was a lot of talk in the United States about a wall, right? And then we had Trump talking about it. Saturn in the Jupiter sign gets really preoccupied with boundaries. Like, where's the limit? What is the limit? Should we have limits? I think we should have limits. I'm not sure. I'm talking about, this is Saturn kind of doing this thing, and I think we might see something similar, although Pisces is different from Sag. There's a difference in terms of their energies. So yeah, I can get what you're saying with Jupiter and Scorpio, which you sure it was 2018? I'm trying to remember. Was it? I seem to think it's like 2016. No, you're right. It's 2018. I have it right here, 2018.
The time.
That was like, it was around that time we were also dealing with the aftermath of the, I think even the Me Too movement.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember writing about that in terms of Jupiter and Scorpio, but that makes sense as we were trying to, again, and I think Saturn may have been finishing his sojourn. Let me just see here, 2018. I think he may have been finishing a little bit. He was finishing as Jupiter was going into Scorpio. Saturn was finishing his sojourn into Sagittarius. That's kind of what I remember. Then he went into Capricorn, where he's been in his domiciles since pretty much 2018.
Long time.
It seems like it. I mean, it's only 4.5 years, but it does seem longer. I mean, especially when we think about the pandemic, I think that's lengthened everything. Like, the difference between 2016 and 2014, I mean 2020, doesn't seem as distant as 2018 to now. It's weird. In terms of the feeling of time. Same 4 years, right? But it feels very different, especially with Saturn, Pluto being in Capricorn, because Saturn was going toward his conjunction with Pluto. So we had that as well. And then we're going to be arcing for Saturn going toward Neptune. I mean, you're bringing up a lot of good points, in terms of, Jupiter paved the way with Pisces. Now we got Saturn going along that same ground, but they're very different, very different.
They are very different. And so, all right, well, let's think about this, because we have a lot of different angles to kind of come at Saturn with Pisces with. And so I just want to give a brief overview when we're just thinking about the Saturn and Pisces transit. So it's right around the corner, March 7th, 2023.
Yeah.
We got Saturn's going in, and it's not leaving. There's no back and forth with this. That is, Saturn is in Pisces, and it will stay there.
I mean, he goes into Aries.
Yes, but not back in Aquarius.
Yeah, he's leaving Aquarius. He's leaving his domicile.
Aquarius is done. Coinciding with a Virgo full moon at that. So it's a grand entrance where
The grand entrance, and then that month Pluto goes into Aquarius. We got all these
yeah,
shifts.
big shifts happening, big shifts. And Saturn's going to be in Pisces for a good amount of time. It doesn't actually leave Pisces until February 13th of 2026, but it will dance in and out in 2025. And most importantly, kind of like what Jupiter did in 2022, it's going to dance over that Aries point of 0 degrees Aries. And maybe most importantly, it's going to be dancing with Neptune, who's right there too, crossing over that same point, and they're going to get ready for a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, our next grand conjunction, that will take place basically a week after Saturn fully moves out of Pisces and into Aries in late February of 2026. So we are we're entering a time here. We are entering a time. So let's talk about just the nature of Saturn. When I say Sam, Saturn, what does Saturn mean to you? What do
Oh,
you
I mean, I
say?
think I might be making this famous. I say Saturn's the planet to sit your ass down, and that has a lot of different nuances to it. I mean, I say it, because I do picture somewhat Samuel L. Jackson as a Saturnian figure, right, in pop culture, and so I think of him as a parallel to Saturn. But Saturn is what prompts us to examine limits, boundaries, discipline, where we decide what we're going to be a disciple of, and how we're going to shape our freedom, in order to be able to continue to make the decisions that we want to make. I think Saturn, when I say sit your ass down, is like related to contemplation
Mm.
and thinking about your options and figuring out what things are. Ficino talks about Saturn is related to aspects of gravitas and melancholy. In terms of, and melancholy isn't just this idea of feeling sad. It is more so related to contemplative aspects of it, studious aspects. And I think because a lot of people get scared of Saturn and think, sit your ass down, like if you're in a game of life and he says, sit your ass down, they think it means something like, oh, you're scolded, but it might be like, maybe you're playing too hard. The score is like 60-2. What are you playing like we're like in the final quarter and we're about to lose? Like, well, just sit your ass down. You might need to take a rest. Like, we pretty much have won. Or it could be like, you're not playing the same game everyone's playing around you. Why don't you sit your ass down and look and see how do you get in alignment and get better into that energy? So that's one way in which I describe him as that kind of planet, although there's a lot more to him, as being traditionally the farthest out planet, concerned and looking at the boundaries. And Saturn is fascinating. Okay, I'll just be very direct and open about this. He's my favorite planet. You would think with me being so Jupiter ruled, Pisces rising, that Jupiter would be it, but Saturn, you always kind of know where you stand with Saturn. And I think the other interesting thing about Saturn, and for your audience, I think of Saturn as the ruler of Aquarius. I don't use modern rulers. I do use modern planets, but I don't use them as rulers. And why Saturn is fascinating, because he has both stories. He started off as a rebel, rebelling against his father Uranus, and cutting his testicles off, which is really rad, right? And throwing them into the sea. um, and then his father curses him and says, like, oh, the same thing's going to happen to you. And then he becomes, ultra conservative, to the point where he's like, well, the kids might take over. Well, let me eat the kids. So, he becomes both the rebel and the tyrant, and the one fearful losing authority and power. So I think that also ties into other elements And the root word of authority is author. So I think he brings to the fore how we think about authorship ourselves and authority with ourselves. So there's a richness to Saturn that can, if we're willing to go beyond the fear. That's how I would see him.
Yeah, I think that last little point is very important, because anybody I brought, what do you think of Saturn moving into Pisces? Or you going? And people, there's a fear, especially all those Virgos out there, all the Virgo planets. They're like, oh no, it's coming from
Pisces. I mean,
with the yeah, well,
yeah.
But I think the Virgos are actually a little more hyper aware of it actually coming. But I do love the bit about authority, though, thinking about that, because I had this conversation with my partner literally yesterday, who my partner got really intimate with. I mean, I got Saturn pretty prominent in my own chart, but my partner has Saturn is a Capricorn with Saturn on the ascendant. So I live with Saturn basically, to some extent. So I walk in there and I was like, hey, what do you think about Saturn moving into Pisces? And he's like, when was it there last? And I gave him the years, and he stopped, he thought about it, and he's like, those were the worst years of my life. And I was like, you know what? Well, you were. He was saying I was moving around a lot. He was young, he's born in the mid 80s. So I was like, you didn't have your own authority then.
Mm-hmm.
You have your own authority now. And so just thinking about that, especially for people that might have looked back at, people that might have mutable risings, and had difficult periods, when the Saturn's angular, like he did, and remembering the power of authority. And every time that we have a Saturn or any transit come around that might be challenging or ask us to grow or shape in some way and evolve as people, we gain more authority with age, hopefully, if we're doing it right, like we learn our lessons. We have evidence from the past and the idea of cause and effect that ramps up, and we're able to make decisions and choices in life from a much more mature perspective. And so just by saying that to him, to calm the fear in that moment, I was like, you're the authority now, own that in this moment, and rethink about your response maybe to that question, and getting kind of like hyper aware of like, oh no.
Yeah. I hope that helps him a lot. It sounds helpful. I think
it was
managing the fear. And I think people fear Saturn because they fear sometimes the constriction that can come with Saturn. But I have found in both my personal experience and professional experience, observing, now thousands of charts, it's recognizing that Saturn can bring this maturing factor, this sometimes a restriction can become a calling toward, embracing more of yourself, understanding limits. Bruce Lee wrote about limits, one book I read of his, and he said something profound I want to share with your audience, and I've shared it before, but it just says, draw a line on a piece of paper, right? And so there's a limit, and we often think when we're faced with a limit that we have to do something to it, right? Like, cut this paper in half or erase part of it. We have to do some work to stop the limitation. But really, the dynamic, like between Saturn and Jupiter, really is this. So one way in which you can make that line shorter is to lengthen your own line, right? And find a way in which you broaden even within a certain limitation or beyond a limitation. That's what Saturn can introduce into the matrix. I don't mean that in the cinematic sense. I mean that more into like the mixture of our lives and how we might talk about things.
I love that. And especially in relation to us talking about Jupiter moving into or sorry, Saturn moving into a Jupiter sign,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, that if there's not a broadening of the line, that's that's possible there. It feels like it makes a lot of sense. And then so let's think about that in relation to of also the breaking of the domicile streak, right?
Yeah.
Because when Saturn's been in its own signs, Capricorn and Aquarius, since December of 2017, I mean, that's a long time. That's Saturn upon Saturn. If anything, that's the line, and the line doesn't move too much.
Yeah,
Or
I have some thoughts about that. I mean, I'll just briefly, you're gonna see the slide again, but so this particular slide, I think sums up Saturn's centralizing powers in Aquarius. We can go back to Capricorn, disperses in Pisces. So it's almost like Saturn in a cardinal Earth sign initiates building things or figuring out things, and then Saturn in Aquarius in a fixed sign, a fixed air sign, is looking to consolidate, bring together. As Saturn was in Aquarius 30 years before this last time, we had the creation and the ascendancy of the World Wide Web. And what we saw with Saturn's return in Aquarius was pretty much a proof of concept of it, because that's what Saturn returns are really about. It's kind of like, well, is this person able to kind of stand on its own? Life has been making it, now can it make life, right? Can it have a life of its own? So like moving from Capricorn, 2017, I think how that articulated, and it's always going to be by other conditional factors, that was more where we were dealing with, structures and government. In the United States, particularly, there was this whole questioning about the fundamental aspects of our government that I don't recall seeing before. And what I mean by that, it was one thing to have a president you didn't like, and that always happens, no matter who's elected. It's another thing to be like, to impeach your president, twice. It's another thing to say that the government is, corrupt or not doing things, or there was just more division and questions people had about their governance than I recall seeing. And then when Saturn moved into Aquarius, it was really kind of prompting us to deal with the deeper understandings, or trying to get some measure of deeper understandings related to our response to government and structures that, with the pandemic, because Saturn was in Capricorn, pandemic surfaces. Well, Mars is also conjoined to the South Node in Capricorn. And then we're in the first, what we didn't know then, but the first year of the pandemic, when Saturn and Jupiter converge for the Great Conjunction in December of 2020. And I think, from those particular moments, it was about how we the people, right, really are functioning. And I think as Saturn prepares to go into Pisces and disperses that Aquarian energy, that consolidation, it's going to be, okay, well, what happens when that disperses and it does come into more, people? You both have ways in which you have, like I mentioned here, internal divisions, but also dramatic leadership changes because, the power is now dispersed among more people, more situations. And how are we going to use that? I also think the question is going to become related to what are the lines? What are the walls? Because that's why I think Saturn really gets concerned about in Jupiter signs. What are the boundaries that we're dealing with here? Good, bad ways, right? I mean, good might be, figuring out, when I say figuring out the boundaries, so for instance, Alexandra Karakostas has an article in the Mountain Astrologer on Saturn and Pisces. And one of the things that she brings up, some things I didn't catch in my research, was that in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted. These were anti-Semitic racist laws. This is in Germany, forbidding marriage between Jewish people and German people, also including Romani and Black people as well. Those are the kinds of things that can surface. I also mentioned in that slide that it seemed to have, Saturn and Pisces seemed to have great powerful effect in the last century, in the 20th century, and into this century. Well, I guess now, in Japan and Africa. So I think we're going to start to see some moves and figuring out like what is happening. And I probably could extend that not just to Japan but Asia, which we're hearing a lot of, between China, Taiwan, and Japan. So anyway,
it makes me think of especially when we think about the lines because when we think about Pisces, we're thinking about, oh, it's boundless, Saturn's the line, right? And so I wonder why it is that Jupiter influence would start to put pressure on defining it more versus when Saturn's like in its own sign. Why do you think that is that Jupiter component?
Saturn's out of his home, out of his depth, right? So it's kind of one thing to go from being the water bearer to being the fuck of water. It's like, I'm just used to this shit in a jar. Like, what's this ocean? Like, where's the shore? Am I in the jar? Right? These are the questions maybe Saturn might entertain. Like, what's going on? And I think he wants, for us as the manifestation related to that, is like we want to figure out the limits. In his own sign, he may even know what the limits are, even though at some level we're figuring it out. But Pisces or Sag doesn't know what they are.
It's almost like a stretching of the limits, like the limit was only the yay, but then it's like, well, let's extend it to this and extend it, kind of like because I read that article too in the Mountain Astrologer the other night, and it started as one group of people, but then it started to add to this group of people, and then it started to add to this group of people, and it's going off of these ideals, right, and beliefs. Because that's the thing too, when we're talking about Jupiter and Pisces, it's very belief oriented.
And yeah, he does that. I mean, Pisces I always kind of define as where we deal with the inner world. So Sagittarius is the outer world related to expansion. The differences we might experience with people, philosophies, ideas. But we go more into the realm of the imagination, of the emotions and intuition when we're talking about Pisces. And so that also goes, like you said, more to religion. Because as the article mentions, we also have the Bosnian War in the last iteration of Saturn and Pisces, where we have the Bosnian conflict between the Serbians, Croatians, and Bosniak Muslims. So we may have a little more of that on top of all the other things that we're dealing with. Uranus and Taurus, Pluto and Aquarius. That's what's always interesting about when we start talking about this from a mundane point of view. It always, one thing is not necessarily going to equal the other. And also in terms of boundaries, one of the things I did appreciate that Alexander brought to my attention was the LSD movement. And so here we are dealing with psilocybin, in terms of that becoming like mainstream and more people talking about microdosing. That might still surface more. It might become even more part of what doctors recommend more. I don't know if doctors are doing that now, but that might be something that we can expect with Saturn and Pisces. And again, that brings up the questions of boundaries in our inner dimensions as well.
And I mean, I can go down to do my shopping at the Trader Joe's and encounter someone with a form that's asking me to sign a petition to put to legalize, medical mushrooms. That's very real here in California,
That's true.
for that being a thing. So, and it is a just the idea of laws or organizations coming into effect or around mind altering substances, right? Because that's a very Piscean thing. Think about the LSD movement in the mid 60s, and just the psychedelics anyways. I mean, think about the music at that time being, a music collector. It's like actually being a psychedelic music collector is very prominent. That's like that was the whole thing there. But even when we look back to when Saturn was in Pisces in the 30s, that's when, Alcoholic Anonymous was founded on the other side of things, where now we have some, an organization that's helping to, because there's that's another side of Pisces, that compassionate side, right? We want to help in the humanitarian with like people that have are having problems or have these addictions. So on the other side of things, it can open up, the line and the boundary can open to have more invitation for these substances in our lives, but also maybe like you think about just obviously we're in a big issue with the prescription pills and fentanyl, and things along those lines. And I think those are going to be big issues that come up. So it can go, it's, our line is shifting, right? It's encasing it with sort of the Alcoholics Anonymous, helping these people out. It's opening it to expand your mind with the mushrooms. And so
Yeah, that's it. Maybe it's like psychedelic, when you picture like apertures going, closing and opening and closing,
yeah.
Like, why is the room breathing? So it's not. I mean, I don't want anyone to think like I'm seeing my room breathing.
Sometimes it does. I go to the park and I'll sit on the grass and I'm just grounding my feet and I'll look at the grass and the grass is breathing. And I'm like, I'm not high. Why am I saying? But if you look closely, like the finite, like reality, like it just kind of starts to open up. The boundary, the veil shifts just a little bit. And you can see like the permeation of what we think reality is.
Well, you just made me realize that there could be another way in which this could surface too. I don't think this goes with the history of spiritualism, but and I think Chris Brennan has talked about this on his show. So what's interesting, because just I think earlier in our conversation we were talking about the growth, not even just the growth, I mean the explosion of astrology. And I don't think that's over, but what I do think may start to happen is that people we could say that astrology becomes this kind of gateway drug, and then they may go into other ways of exploring spirituality and spiritualism. And I think that may be what Saturn and Pisces may also suggest. And you might say like, well, what did Jupiter and Pisces do that? Maybe a little bit, but Jupiter is only a year roughly. Saturn's going to be 2.5 years, along with Neptune being in the same domicile. So I think people may be looking for things even beyond astrology, which is why I've predicted, we'll see if this comes to pass. I think evolutionary and psychological astrologies are going to get another pass. Because folks have gotten during Saturn in his domiciles into traditional astrology, like, okay, what are the lines, right?
Yeah.
It's like, let's go back, blah blah blah. And I think what may start to happen is kind of like, okay, so we went back. I know that Mercury's in his chariot, and or he's a spear bearer, or he's this, but so what? What's that got to do with my inner world, right? What does that mean for me? And what are the spiritual implications of that? The inner realms, which is what Pisces is interested in. So that might be another way in which we might see things surface more.
Yeah, no, well, it's so interesting. So interesting that you bring that up, Sam, just because, if anybody's following the world of astrology, there's been some hot ticket issues. I'm not going to go into it here, but there's some hot ticket issues going on, especially around house systems. But I love what you're saying there, because it is true. There was a rise of, especially on the focus of astrology, into uh, traditional, ways of thinking and ways of practicing. And it does leave that. What about me? What's going on in my inner world? I mean, that's a lot of reasons why people get into astrology in the first place. So I don't know more about themselves and this complex mechanism of feelings and emotions and past lives, and all those types of
Yeah,
things.
and all those things become important. I think, you know, just to go a little bit in my journey and then, out of it, toward the general realm, I started off in psychological astrology, and maybe you did too.
Yeah.
Um, and then when I discovered traditional, I, went into my zealot phase and like, this is the truth, the way, and the life, like this is it. This is what we have. Fuck psychological. And this was even true for me up until like 2016. Fuck psychological astrology. And then I had people check me like Lynn Bell and Christopher Renstrom being like, what are you talking about, little man? Like, what is going on? And they didn't say anything like that, but it was like, but basically did check me. And I'm like, wait, what am I doing? Right? If I become the zealot again, because I used to be a minister and evangelical. And it made me realize, there is some heightened value in psychological astrology. Like if you read Liz Green, as she can have her problems and different issues, but the material is rich. Karen Hamaka Zondak, the material is rich. In terms of exploring that. And then of course, Stephen Forrest for evolutionary astrology, Jeffrey Wolf Green, those principles, even though I'm not in alignment with all of them, but it gets us to think a different way. And so Saturn and Pisces might surface some of these other things for us, because we've been traditional and we've seen the mounting of it, and it's kind of paid this sense of connection. And maybe these house wars will bring it up even more. Like, what if we went beyond the houses? So
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of the thing. We can't forget about Pisces being that duality and that double-bodied sign in this transitional space that can hold two, ideas or beliefs
here.
at once. And so this is my idea, is like, how do we meld these in? Because there is some validity to some good, hard, fast rules. you know I love a good rule. Like my Capricorn moon's like, yeah, give me that. I can latch on to that. But how do they when we expand that to, like you're bringing up with the interpersonal realm, there's a space for both. And that's, so when people ask me like, what kind of astrologer are you, I like to say that I'm a modern traditionalist because essentially I'm both. It's both at the same time, and they're both valid, and they both have so much to offer. And so going one way or the other is not, I mean, to each their own. Everybody has their own practice, but I feel like there's a richness that's there, and maybe we're still just trying to figure out how to integrate it, and that's okay.
Right. I
Um,
mean, that's a very good point to make. I mean, especially related to Pisces and its point of integration. Because one thing I also talk about with Pisces when I talk about signology, and I also had an article I have an article in this Mountain Astrologer that
I
we were
read it
talking.
last night.
Oh, thank you, with Alexandra Katakostas. But also I was talking about the Zodiac Mafia in the previous one, which is the uh what do they call it? The yearbook. And one of the things that I was talking about, I mean, there are three signs that people really underestimate and, fuck over at their own peril. Libra as the Don of the Zodiac Mafia, Capricorn as the Capo of the Zodiac Mafia, and then Pisces as the Consigliere as of the Zodiac Mafia. And what that means, there is some aspect of Pisces that likes chaos. I have found that um in multiple ways, because even if you look at like Paisley, the actual, like, I'm into Prince, you look Paisley, it looks almost like those two fish swimming,
Mm-hmm.
right? And Paisley is actually can be related to the sense of chaos, and like, and even with the sea, as much as we see the sea and it looks placid on the surface, but beneath the surface, it's crazy. right? There's, you know, there are dolphins punking sharks, killer whales doing things, some other creature that we don't even know in the depths. Like we know more about space than we know about our own sea. And I think that also is Pisces, where it's like, it may be Saturn where it's like, oh, you think you know me? You think you know this? You don't know this.
Sit
Yeah,
your ass down.
put your ass down, right? Exactly. Well said. That's the other dimension that I love. I tell Piscean influence people, as a Piscean influence person myself, there's some part of yourself you're never going to know. And there's some part of, yourself that others may not know or fully understand, because it's like the sea. So it's like, it's Saturn almost in a hopeless enterprise of trying to figure out the boundaries in the boundless.
Mm, I love that because we talk about the great mystery of life just in general, but the great mystery that is us. And, getting to Pisces is the last sign of the zodiac, right? Right before Aries there. And there's so much that, think about the person that you are today.
Right.
And if you go back 20 years ago, granted, if you're at least that old,
if you're old enough to do that,
if you're old enough to do that, and what can you say about yourself today that then was a complete mystery to you?
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's plenty of things. And that's actually the beauty of transits like these, right? Because Saturn comes to give form, or at least that's what it's trying to do, right? It's trying to give form. It's trying to give, surface to reality, or maybe sometimes transcend and leave room for something else to surface. That's another sort of thing that can come up through this. But on the non-fearful side, think of the things that you could discover that's part of this ocean. I have this image, Sam, of just like going down and I have my snorkel on, and I'm just looking and I'm like, what am I gonna see down here?
That's what I think about all the time, and I talk about Pisces, I think, in ways different from what I normally hear. So for instance, backstory, I used to do adventure game theater, which is more live action role play. And just as a point of reference, I don't think this is true for all Pisces, but I, one time we had this one particular game, which was like, live action role playing. And we had this one game where this Pisces was this really dark, malefic character, who could cause pain to other characters in it. And it was played by, like I said, a guy who's March 1st or something like that. Anyway, he was very good in his role. And I was kind of like, what made him so good in his role? And I asked him later, like, well, because you really could inflict, pain in a certain way, although it was, everyone was acting, that really seemed, very poignant, like you knew where to hit. And he was like, yeah, because I could, through empathy, feel what they were feeling and then know where to hit. And I was like, oh, that also is the darker side of Pisces. It's kind of like empathy can be weaponized. We don't think about that, but it's kind of like, oh, I know where to hit you. So I think that's also one other dimension of Pisces, and maybe that might also be something that we deal with in the best possible sense, which is more compassion, but it could be other things that surface with it. Like we saw it in the 60s with, the war on poverty, or the attempt to kind of, challenge that. So we do hope that we go more toward the Great Society, but at the same time, we could be dealing with more, other ways in which people experience pain. I hope not.
Well, and I think this just brings us right back to the mutable point. And it's a little bit of both. It's like it's hard. It feels like it would be hard to say it would go one or the other, and I mean, such is life, I guess we could say. It's like you get a little bit of both. But
good and bad fish, or the good.
Yeah, you get good fish and bad fish, and you gotta Try to throw back
Go with
one,
the
try to
flow.
keep the other, see what see what you get there. But I did, and that is a nice thing about the Saturn in Pisces. Well, it's interesting, right? Once again, it's kind of a double-edged sword because there are these themes of Saturn and Pisces bringing out, especially in the 60s and in the 30s, and there are massive other outer transits going on during these times too, especially in the 60s. Like we're not recreating that period because that was a special place in time. With just, with Uranus and Pluto, opposing Saturn, and then Jupiter coming into the mix and all that. But
Absolutely.
there was, there's these themes of, right, we're coming back to the idea of like structure and authority and systems and in government. And there's these themes that come out with creating organizations, or when you talk about the Great Society that you were just talking about, to help eliminate poverty and racial injustice. And the Higher Education Act came out then, which I find very ironic actually, because the Higher Education came out in the mid 60s to give people allow people aid to go to college and universities, the people that couldn't afford it. And so it'll be interesting coming back around here, especially since there's like this holding period that's going on with the student loan forgiveness that is taking place, and how it was going through, but then all these lawsuits came in from different states trying to stop it, and so now it's halted. So I'm very intrigued to see if that will pick back up and actually be able to go through when
That's
Saturn.
interesting. That's a good tie-in. Yeah, I mean, because that's also Jupiter's realm as well
Yeah,
in terms of higher education,
yeah.
and that makes sense.
And
Yeah.
so we see these social the Social Security Act in the 30s that came out, and there was a court case in the United States versus Butler that gave Congress the right to tax and then spend that on general welfare. So there are these like programs that seem to come up with Saturn and Pisces that are for, the general good, or especially for people that, are on maybe the more marginalized side of things, or deal with, and that's where I say the double-edged sword. It's like the government and the program comes in to help this, but they're helping something that has hardship in some way. So it's not like a boon upon a boon. It's like there's difficulty there and there's struggle. But how can we help this? How can we alleviate it? How can we set up systems that are kind and care, or seemingly do? There's
Right.
always gray area.
Yeah. How do we do Jupiterian things in an effective way? How do we do Saturnian things in a kind way? So that, it honors both. And, I guess I'm a little skeptical of Saturn in that position.
Mm,
Like what we saw with Saturn in Sagittarius, just as like again, a parallel, even though it's not exact, because it's again a fire mutable sign as versus a watery mutable sign. But Saturn in Sagittarius was kind of like, well, what are we going to do? There was a lot of conversation about refugees, a lot of
yeah.
conversation about undocumented people, right? Like, what are we going to do about them? We got a range of answers. One particular answer that was popular was like, let's build a wall, right? And we're not going to pay for it. And then the other answer was kind of like, well, you know, let them in, find space, blah, blah, blah. I think we may see a similar thing, but it may go in a lot more a sense of detail. Because when Jupiter was in Pisces, even again in the 60s and then even in the 90s as a parallel, there was also this moment as a quote unquote war on poverty, but not just in the United States. There was one that was also in Europe. But what's interesting, there's always some kind of a backlash to that, and I don't know how we get beyond that. When I say a backlash, so Saturn might be in Pisces, makes these changes to maybe even guaranteed income. And then Saturn's going to move into Aries. Like, well, what about me? I'm a fucking individual, and I've been like trudging along, trying to make it on my own, and that's what other people should do. So it's this interesting dynamic, and I don't know if we can break the cycle. I mean, that's kind of the magic of the planets moving on and going through through
Yeah.
each station. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's kind of the thing. But yeah, I just think about that with Saturn and Pisces and some of the things you mentioned with Social Security. Looking out for the common good, but in a way that's also respectful, compassionate, attentive. So, which makes me wonder, like, well, what might be coming up? Is this also, I mean, like, we're going to be dealing with this year-long war in Ukraine. So we'll be dealing with some of the issues related to that. I don't know. And then I think I'm making a prediction. This thing that's happening in East Palestine, that's a big issue. I think that's going to be a big issue for 2024. And I also, it makes me wonder if Pete Buttigieg is ever going to be president from that. So that's another thing. Because, I mean, with Saturn about to go into Pisces and the questions that people are asking in East Palestine, whether they're legit or illegit, I mean, but there's still questions that are in the American polity. I think that is something that is significant about who do we care for and how and why. Again, now maybe if it were any other kind of people, it could have been the same kind of thing, but there are questions. It is intriguing to me because as soon as I heard people on the right, and again, I'm not advocating for one side or another on your podcast, right? But as soon as I heard people from the right saying like, oh, this is just racism and this is blah, 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 I was like, well, I don't know. I'm always going to have a knee-jerk reaction to somebody talking about racism when there are white people involved, right? My bias and my training in African-American studies. But if I got beyond my bias and my question, I was like, well, yeah, why did it take you 3 weeks to get down there? Like, what is that? Why are you in Ukraine before you're in East Palestine? Like, what is that though? I mean, I think that's a sensible question. And it makes me think back related to even Hurricane Katrina, where one could also say, like, well, there was racism at play. Well, I'm not going to say it's just racism, but there's some way in which we are not clear on us and them and what constitutes them, what constitutes us. And I think that's what the United States, particularly as US, as us, really needs to figure out.
Yeah, I think that's a solid point. And I mean, Gray Crawford just released a excellent little, well, not so little, it's an hour long, but a YouTube video on the East Palestine. He did a breakdown of the transits new, like he did a full treatment. Go check that out if you like mundane astrology, because it's pretty fascinating. And there's a lot of Saturn and Neptune energy that are involved in it. So you're not wrong about that, Sam. I think that is going to be a big thing that comes up. And there, well, yeah, who do we help? Who gets help and why?
Who gets help?
Who gets help and why?
Yeah, why? I mean, that's a big question. And so Saturn in Aquarius was probing that question for the whole time, pretty much the whole time we had COVID, or we still have COVID, but dealing with the pandemic.
Yeah.
Right. I'll just say this. I mean, why I said it like, well, while we were dealing with COVID, because there's some who claim, like President Biden, the pandemic's over, and there's some who were saying like, well, it's not over. But Saturn is leaving an Aquarius, going into Pisces. I think we are entering a different phase relating to the pandemic. which brings up the same question of like, how do we care for each other? Can I get on a tangent related to that? I know we have some other
Oh, I
things.
love it. I love tangents. Bring it
It's not
on.
that far from it, but it is, going a bit into the politics of some things. One of the, I am not, okay, I won't get into the anti-vax issue, but I will say this. One of the things I found fascinating during the pandemic, between the questions of mandating vaccination and stipulating that people must get vaccine for the greater good, was that we were asking that of private citizens, but we weren't asking that of institutions. And when I say that, meaning like, why don't hospitals have enough beds for people? Right? Like, what is that? Or the reports we would have like the hospitals are crowded, but then the people going to hospitals and no one was there. you know and I've heard this firsthand and seen elements of it, so it's kind of like, well, why aren't we asking more of our institutions, of these hospitals, um related to our care and how we get care? I'm going to say even the bad word, universal health care. Why are we still not why are we without that? Even with Republicans saying like, we don't want Obamacare. Okay, cool. What you got? You got something better? Well, yeah, we'll get back to you about that. These are I think critical questions also for Saturn and Pisces, that are extensions from Saturn being into Aquarius.
Absolutely. I mean, when we bring up the issue of like helping people in like a poverty line status, it's another thing in the mid-60s, right? Medicaid and Medicare came out there. And
Mm-hmm.
so how do we get into these poverty lines? Well, we're paying for a lot of things. People get sick. People become, unsheltered because they had a sickness in bills and then lose their house, like in situations that don't have to happen, because the order in the choices of care and protection in the umbrellas, to keep people safe and secure in the society, are in the wrong places.
Right.
They haven't chosen to reallocate, where that care is, because the care is in their pockets. It's lining their pockets, and they like they like that care. And there's all to I reading your article last night, Sam, actually, about the Taurus Scorpio axis. Yeah, and thinking about that, and just I mean, even likening it to this situation, right? With the Taurus, because I'm comfortable with that. Why would I take my comfort away? Like, why would I change for the the difficulties and the hardship and the pain and the for everyone else, when I'm in
Right.
power and I'm so comfortable.
That's absolutely spot on. I think that's what we have to ask ourselves. Like, well, and that's not just on the dimension of race. I mean, that's also class,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is an issue in America as well. I think Saturn and Pisces will be very interesting that way. I think we Americans, and I know your listeners may also be other nationalities, but I can only speak from a solidly informed basis about what's happening in this country. I can speculate and also understand some things in other countries. Like there's some parallels with Canada, in some parts of Europe. But what I anticipate is that we may see, some measure of the Empire Strike Back, right? We in Saturn Aquarius, I always think of Saturn Aquarius as his, toppling Uranus phase. And we can go backwards, meaning that he's, Saturn Aquarius is kind of like, I'm gonna knock Papa out and cut his balls off. And then after he does it, it's kind of like, what have I done? Same could happen to me. Then it becomes a lot more protective Capricorn, right? As he goes into another, what we could say, receptive sign. I don't like to use male or female, masculine, feminine, as much with describing the elements. He is now he's going into a receptive sign. I think there's a protective, conservative quality that comes with that often. So I'm curious to see what we might see, in our own polity, in our politics. And I think both parties should be, aware, because I can easily imagine, I think some of this is happening already, but I can easily imagine, let's just go with the right. Again, I don't know your politics. You might be like, Ngawa, Black Power, or it could be, or it could be like, Trump 24. I don't know. I mean, I don't know anything about your politics. If you're friends with Nicholas Polomonakos, I mean, I can speculate, but one can't know for certain. But what I can imagine, to say just with the right as an example, because the left is easy, if it's, I lean left. But with the right, I mean, we might see more of a conservative movement that's even more conservative than Trump, right? I think one of the things I anticipate, it's not just his personality that many conservatives have a problem with. It may be that they don't see him as right enough, as right wing enough. I think that may also be a challenge for him in his candidacy. That's why I think really may go down.
Well, my brain, as you're talking there, my brain fast forwarded to the Jupiter Uranus conjunction in Taurus, and thinking about, because that's a big thing that we're going to talk about here, is just thinking about the importance of Jupiter's role in this, right? Because we keep talking about Saturn being in a Jupiter sign, Well, what's Jupiter doing? This is a big part of what is, dictating Saturn's orders. And then same on top of that, when you think about, big news in the skies around the same time with Pluto starting to dance into Aquarius. Well, this is still a Saturn sign. So, Pluto is forming that chain with Saturn too, and Jupiter. So Jupiter has a good amount of pull going on here. And as Saturn moves into Pisces, we have Jupiter in Aries, which is a unique period, right? We are at the beginning, right next door, the beginning of the zodiac, that cardinal fire. And basically the whole time that Saturn is in Pisces, we're going to have Jupiter move through Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and even Cancer. So it's a long haul here. And I started thinking about that, looking back at these other periods, right? In the 90s and the 60s and the 30s. And in the 90s, Jupiter was in Scorpio, Sagittarius, and in Capricorn. And in the 60s, it was, I believe it was the same as what we're experiencing it with, like Taurus, Gemini, and Cancer. I wrote this down, of course, and now I can't see it. Where'd my notes go? But I was noticing how it was like alternating between periods of kind of Jupiter moving through these same little chunks of signs. And so, I mean, Sam, what do you think about just Jupiter moving through sort of these, the first four signs of the zodiac, and how that will color Saturn in the last sign?
So the planets move faster through the signs of short ascension, right? So Jupiter moves pretty fast. And for your audience, the signs of short ascension are from Capricorn to Gemini. So the signs of long ascension, just to be also spell that out, it's from Cancer to Sagittarius. And so Jupiter is speeding through. If it's not your imagination or anyone's imagination, like, does he sail through Aries pretty fast? Yeah.
Yes.
He does. And he goes into Taurus, and he's in Taurus. Once he goes into Taurus, he's in Taurus the whole year and into part of 2024. And then he's going to go to Gemini, and then he starts to slow down and, stays in a sign for a year as he gets closer to Cancer. And we're also going to be contending with Uranus finishing, going into 25, 26, finishing his sojourn into Taurus. And again, I'm not saying this to scare people, but I want to alert people that we're dealing with some powerful tectonic shifts. And when I say that this next part, and I don't mean to scare people, the United States has never not been at war when Uranus has gone into Gemini.
Nope.
And what I see, and again, I'm not going to conjecture on the scope of this war. I mean, I do think whenever we talk about war, we think about, is it going to be like The Walking Dead? Is it going to be like apocalyptic? And it doesn't have to be, right? Really, it really doesn't. I mean, like, there's been 2 Gulf Wars, there's been a Vietnam War, there's all these other different wars that, it didn't happen the same way where it was apocalyptic. But I do think, it may be a test in a trying time. And Saturn being in a sign of Jupiter, and Jupiter making these motions, especially going toward Uranus, then going again toward a square between Gemini and Cancer toward Neptune. All these things really do point to some really serious shifts. And I think it requires us to pay attention and start thinking about how we contribute to that. How do we start doing the Jupiterian thing in the Saturnian way? Real meaningful goodness. One example of that, when Saturn was in his own sign, I'm just going to call it as I see it. When Saturn was in his own sign and we had George Floyd murdered, he was in Capricorn, and then I think that he went into Aquarius toward the end of the year. There was a lot of apology and wringing of the hands and all these particular things, but did it really lead to fundamental change, long-standing change? No. Right? And so it's almost in Saturn and Pisces in the sign of Jupiter, we might have a chance to really do good, not just say good. And I think that really becomes, the challenge for us. And Jupiter, moving through these signs, maybe even going toward 2 cardinal signs, Aries and in his exaltation in Cancer, might be even ways in which we really start making good on it. You might say, like, well, with the war on poverty didn't really solve poverty. No, but it did help, or it was an attempt to create good. I think that was important. It led to some actual institutions, some changes. One of the, it also paved the way for affirmative action and, using Title VII with lowering discrimination against certain classes of people. And people, this is like a sidebar, but it's directly related even to the astrological world. One of the things that's exciting about seeing people like you, seeing people like me and you together in one particular arena, is we really haven't been actively part of astrology's history in the last thousands of years. You're like, what do you mean? Black men or people and white women, right? The beneficiaries from these changes from the last time Saturn was in Pisces and we had Uranus in Virgo, a lot of them were, black men, but also white women. White women have been among the most serious beneficiaries of, some of the changes that have come about in trying to deal with more of a public and common good. I think that's important to recognize. So there was sustainable change, and it has affected, who's doing astrology, who are the faces we see related to doing astrology. 2 women head up the Mountain Astrologer. We have Jen Zart and Ray Sapp as a director and publisher. I think that's a significant change. So anyway, I could wax poetic about that, but
well, you saved me, Sam, during a coughing attack. My Jesus,
I saw that. I was like, okay.
Woo! Well, it's so interesting too, because from a spiritual perspective, they say that when people have coughing issues and throat, there's the kind of this question of what needs to change. And so here you were talking all about change, and all of a sudden I'm coughing up a storm. I'm like, geez,
my lung.
my lung. But I think you're absolutely right about that. Like giving these platform to it is unique to see me and you sitting here waxing poetic about astrology. Like I love using Jen Zard as an example of like heading, Mount Astrologer. I'm a musician, and I like the other day I go to these different engineering sites that are selling, musical equipment for recording. And what I notice about every single website, like if I had looked at that even like 2 years ago, every single picture I would have seen is some man behind a console doing the thing. Every single picture was a woman. And I
Well,
was like, this is interesting to me, like especially, Pisces being so connected with the arts and music and creativity and everything too. So that's a nice thing about Saturn and Pisces. I think we're going to have a nice you know, uh, a nice oomph in the musical creation realm. But I thought that was very interesting and could sense
that's the
this,
point.
yeah, this tide turning, so to speak, on representation, and opening it up, as to, who's, and if it's not open up, people demand that, right? Another thing too, I saw on Hulu yesterday, they're advertising a show that's called, oh, I'm gonna botch it, but it's about writing music for movies and shows and stuff like that. And every single person they had interviewed was all white men, basically. And I went to go read the podcast reviews, and it was just person after person just saying, "There's no women here." Like it was just 1-star reviews based not necessarily that the content was bad, it was because the representation wasn't there.
Right.
And it's
I
like,
think that's an interesting point, because I think people are asking more related to representation. And again, that's Jupiter, you know, who's on the boundaries? Saturn is the outer bounds. He's a ring past naught. So people are going to be asking like, okay, so who are these people? And there's going to be like the two fish, those who want to keep some out, and there's going to be some who want to keep some in, or bring more in. I think that becomes really one other way in which we can start to think about Saturn and Pisces. And sometimes that may just bring chaos, going back to what I said earlier about, what can happen when we're talking about, Saturn and Pisces, or Pisces in general. So
yeah,
I think it's exciting. I mean, what I can talk about personally, because I alluded to this earlier. So this is my second go around of Saturn and Pisces in my life. I missed the other time when he was before I was born.
just missed it by a hair.
Like I said, I'm glad I opted out, because that was a Saturn Uranus opposition. That was 1966. In part of 65, it was a lot of disruption, and when Saturn went over Pisces, or went in Pisces last time over my ascendant, I embarked on a career in theater. So I was kind of playing with the dimensions of self. My
Very
mom,
fitting.
yeah, mom passed.
Hmm.
But also Pluto was conjoined to my sun. So
Mm.
different factor,
Yeah.
right? So that was one particular thing. But I think I was also dealing with a lot of, exploring inner realms. So if someone is mutable or very mutably, affected, whether it's their ruler of their ascendant, or they have mutable angles, I would say Saturn, going back to when I said sitting your ass down, it can be a way of deeper exploration. Like I have a journal behind me and on that bookshelf. I did a lot of journaling while Saturn was in Pisces last time. A lot of writing. And not that that's going to be the answer for anybody and everybody, right? But what it could be is, again, that those attentiveness to your inner worlds. Where do you find this boundless self within? Which always prompts questions without. I mean, like, as soon as Saturn went into Aries, I think there was a whole different way that I had taken those, I guess, those deep dives and sought to put them out in a different way in the world, from acting more, because I started off more behind the scenes or behind the stage, and then moved myself to the stage and then screen and other things. And I think that came out more while Saturn was in Aries, the Saturn return.
That Saturn return. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the the kind of the emergence that can come with the Aries versus, because I mean, think about Saturn in the first house. It's yeah, it's like why did I just have the term "The Shape of Water"? I've never even seen that movie, but
I
I
haven't
just thought
either, but
about
that's
that.
a very good way of putting
Yeah,
it.
The Shape of Water. Well, everybody watch that and get back to me. Is that even relevant? But there is, it's a constructing. And so it doesn't surprise me that you were behind the scenes. You had your feet in the water. You were testing it out before it was like, yes, I value this. I have this talent. Let me go. Let me go give this a go.
Yeah. So, I think it's interesting to kind of see him on his way back. And I'll be honest, I mean, a few months ago, if you had talked to me, because we astrologers are always our worst astrologers, meaning for ourselves.
Yeah.
And, it almost caught me by surprise. I don't know, maybe this was 6 months ago. I was like, Saturn's hitting into Pisces. Oh shit, that's happening then. Oh, and I did have this moment, at least for a little while, like this trepidation, because again, it was trauma. I mean, the trauma of losing my mom. And I remember because Saturn was within a degree of my ascendant. That's one of the reasons how I knew, like, I started rectifying my chart a little bit. And I was like, oh, this probably is closer to the time. And that's one of the big moments, because I do know when my mom died and when I found out about it. And, you just can't, especially if you're old enough to remember last time Saturn was in Pisces. Yes, the cosmos does rhyme, but it doesn't mean it always repeats. So I think it's recognizing that Saturn may return to some themes, but be different. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, lo and behold, now, even though Saturn hasn't moved into Pisces, but just in the last, I would say, not even fully a month, I've gotten 3 or 4 different scripts and a call for an audition.
Love it.
And I haven't been acting, pretty much, I want to say 15 years, maybe more, close to 20. So, it's that kind of thing you deal with in terms, because I was an actor for 10 years and then transitioned out of that more into astrology and tech training. And here's Saturn kind of just coming back, and it's like, get that boy doing stuff again, so we'll see, but
Resurfacing you.
resurfacing. So
Yeah.
the things to think about. This is my example. It's like, I don't want anyone coming back. Yeah, Sam said I was going to act, and I was in like a school play. That's not what it's kind of, if you've lived 30 years, let's say, even if you were younger than when I was, let's say you were 14, then, this is, you'll be 44.
That's how old I was. Basically, that's when I had the Saturn Pisces.
So you might think about how it might manifest for you, with the understanding that you were 14, you were at your Saturn opposition, right, or close to it. Your Saturn's in Virgo?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, and the nodes, like there's that sensitive spot. The sensitive spot in my chart where it hits the nodes, Mars and Saturn all at the same time. When Neptune hit that spot, woo. No, that was
And also, yeah, let's talk about that. So another thing for people to use as markers is think about when Jupiter hit that point, right, in Pisces. What kind of surfaced for you? So for me, what was interesting, so last year I went to see a play. It was my first play at the Santa Fe Playhouse, right? Hadn't gone. So, and I hadn't gone into a theater, right, like most people, in at least 2 years. So I went to the Santa Fe Playhouse, saw this play. I think it's hashtag something. It was the influence of social media and things like that. So I'm seeing these two women acting. Then the following year, this is when Jupiter was in Pisces. The following year, as we're approaching Saturn going into Pisces, I'm in a play reading with these same two actors. Right. So it's kind of like, you have to pay attention to, it gives you some indications, Jupiter and Pisces, Saturn and Pisces. Similarly, since we haven't talked much about Pluto, think about what was happening when Jupiter and Saturn had their conjunction at 0 degrees Aquarius, and what that might mean related to, your chart, as Pluto's going into Aquarius, right? So that's where you can start to, because some people are like, well, what's going to happen? Well, you have some sense of it, right? It's like nothing. It's not like you don't have anything, but you can kind of, recollect what has happened that you might find useful.
Yeah. And well, that point will be interesting to think about, just because one of the things we've done a lot of talking about Saturn and Pisces and Jupiter and its relation there too. And that's the thing, is like the Jupiter Saturn cycle, right? This is a big astrological cycle. And so even thinking about, Saturn being in Jupiter's sign, Jupiter's getting far enough away now to where it's going to make that sextile with Saturn once it gets into Taurus, on June 19th. But it will be just a month after Jupiter makes a square to that 0 degrees Pluto Aquarius that's going to be on that point. So there's a lot of hearkening back to that, asking people to hearken back to that time and kind of think about it. There's correlations between all these planets working together, and the opening energy that's going to be coming in May and June, that Jupiter is kind of dispersing by contacting both Pluto and then Saturn. Pluto on that degree, and then Saturn, just because that's opening that cycle further. So I'm interested to see what will kind of disperse itself there. I don't know if you have any thoughts or not, but
No, I don't know if anything jumps immediately. I mean, like sextiles are still aspects, and I know we always think, oh, there's softer aspects, but I think, even from squares to trines, Jupiter, especially in contact with Pluto, really, is kind of a meeting of powerful people. Now that could be the people, the people united can never be defeated. Oh, I'm not trying to mock that, but it's a catchy song, mobilize it. So maybe a people to, united may come together, but it also may be where we, I've been talking about tectonic shifts. There's some things that are happening, behind the scenes that we don't know. And I don't mean in some Illuminati way. I mean, it's just like in terms of more politicians deciding, particular things and negotiating particular aspects of things. Like something is, I'll give you an example. Putin pulling out of the, nuclear accords. You're like, okay, well, he pulled out. Why would he do that? Because maybe he might be thinking like, I want to have the option to use a bomb. That's kind of just an example of some, things shifting in order to kind of create a different playing field. So Jupiter and Pluto squared could signify some things like that. The sextile to Saturn might signify just the opposite. Right now, we see Poland as the biggest embrace of Ukrainian refugees. Maybe there might be some other countries that step up, So these are the things that we can contemplate.
yeah. And so I guess kind of the last thing just to kind of talk about before we kind of wrap it up is thinking about, I mean, this whole thing is is getting to, Saturn's going to get closer and closer to Neptune, basically throughout this all, which we talk about tectonic plates and dispersing and things happening kind of behind the scenes. This definitely feels like that, just because, I mean, a conjunction at 0 degrees Aries, like, and that's and Jupiter's going to basically being square from
Cancer?
Gemini into Cancer, but there's going to be 3 of them basically, so it'll do the squares in the mutable squares, and then the cardinal square kind of finishes it off. June 15th through the 18th of 2025, I think, is that's that.
Well, the positive aspects of Saturn Neptune is always where one can deal with a different element of envisioning and revisiting things. It's kind of the way in which you can look to give shape to what is in the realm of intuition, imagination, along the spiritual realms. And maybe that might also be the advocacy or the advent of, a certain kind of spiritualism or aspects of it. Saturn Neptune on the more challenging side can speak to dissolution, where some things that had long been established lose some measure of their power. And again, I want to discourage people, and this is what I say to my clients too. I want to discourage people from thinking about the worst case scenario, right? Because we always think like, well, then we're just going to die. It's going to be a bomb. And that doesn't have to be, it can be other things that can be challenging. Saturn, Neptune at the Aries point could be more so signifying where the US dollar is not the standard currency for the world. So might be bad for America, but it's not bad for the, for the world.
Yeah, we're not all combusting here.
It's kind of like, and with that knowledge, I think there are practical things you can do. Like if you've built, your wealth just on dollars, you might have a problem. But if you built your wealth on, like if you invest in gold or, precious metals, or, if you're really into cryptocurrency, it might be some elements related to that. So again, we don't have to think like, oh, everything's just going to go to shit. It might be like, you can plan ahead as a good astrologer or someone interested in astrology and think, what else could that be? And you might think about the parallel, because Saturn, this is not the first time Saturn is, conjoined to Neptune. So that's another thing to kind of take into account. Yeah, those are some of the things I might say for us to, and I think, so Chris Brennan, we're not going to get too deep into this house war, but he did mention something interesting at the end of his 6-hour and 45-minute talk, that this house war seems to be very sensitive to, connection between Saturn and Neptune. So he anticipates that Saturn-Neptune conjunction may be another moment where we're dealing with this issue. And maybe it's not going to be the same issue, but a different permutation of it, of the debate. We're, siderealists get involved. I don't know. I mean, it could be like something else, some other way, and we, or maybe there's some measure of resolution. We see Chris and Deb shaking hands, or something like that. I don't know.
That'll be the day.
That'll be the day.
That'll be the day.
I don't know. It could be, I don't know. It could be something related to, some aspect related to astrology.
Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting just to think about like just the trajectory of from grand conjunction to grand conjunction, right? Like just everything that's happened in the world, and like thinking about, and starting a whole new air age, and we are under immense change, and we're trying to figure it out, and certain forms don't work, and we're redreaming, or we want to redream, like
correct.
And we can't fix everything, but there is, maybe that's just my eternal optimist inside inside my Leo planet speaking, where I'm like, that's something powerful about that 0 degrees Aries. If something's really got to change, if we really do need new structure, if we do, tapping in to find that compassion in our hearts. It's a exact sextile to the Jupiter Saturn. I know we're talking about sextiles again, but
Sexy sextiles, yeah.
the sexy sextile, maybe, sometimes things do have to collapse or crumble. That's not a bad thing. If they're not like serving the growth or the greater populace or the really new beginnings that we all keep talking about that we want, but either it's too hard to do or we're too scared to do it, or some systems blocking that, like that's my hope for it, is that there's just some sort of change, some
Yeah,
sort of dissolving that helps what we really want this world to look like, to just be that much closer into that ideal view. It's not going to be perfect, but how do we get, just that much closer?
I agree. And even a dissolution. I mean, we as Americans on some level have been spoiled because we've been able to have pretty much without serious coups, depending on who you talk to, but um we've had a system of government that has generally maintained itself, at least over the last 150 years. I'm not going to say 200 years, because we did have a civil war, right? But I think, as versus other countries where they've had, imagine if you lived in Germany. I'm not just talking about Hitler's Germany, but even from post-Hitler era, after the Fourth Reich, and seeing or the Third Reich, seeing what happened, like you got your country split in two, right? That was a whole different mindfuck that we haven't experienced that way, or even Japan. So I think, there are ways in which we might experience dissolution that still allows us to survive and find ways to thrive. Like, life didn't stop in Germany, life didn't stop in Japan, life didn't stop in Russia. When Russia's government drastically changed from Union of Soviet Socialist Republics to something else, to the the Russian Republic, the Federation. That's what it is, the Russian Federation. So I think that's those are things for us to contemplate, that we can make a commitment to go on and make a commitment to each other. Maybe that's kind of what we could say to Saturn. I think I'll just say this in your notes. She's like, what's one key word to recap Saturn and past Pisces? I would say commitment. Or okay, I'll cheat too. Inspired commitment.
You're allowed to cheat.
Okay,
Most people do. Doing one's hard. That's why I do it. Inspired commitment.
Yeah,
I can get behind that.
Inspired commitment, rather than just thinking like it has to be. I'm committed to kind of seeing the struggle through. So, however it goes, and that's kind of like, what we have to remember, what was going on in 1994 to 96. There was a lot of, people seem to forget, there's a lot of upheaval at that time too, coming off the heels of, the riots in LA. People want to remember fondly the Clinton years, but they weren't always fond, and they weren't always great. So there's some things that to deal with as well. So.
I'm trying to think of what my word would be, but the boundless sea has trapped me. Has trapped me within its. I have the two words, and I was thinking about purposeful, or maybe it's a meaningful erosion. Because I was thinking about the where you're just talking about like the boundaries, and it's like all, or all structures, erode at some time, and that's not a bad thing. It's not it's not a bad thing
Well,
in
I'm
my
thinking
mind.
maybe you're saying maybe the out tide is one way to think about it. Like the tide going back.
Oh, the out tide,
Hmm.
the exhale.
Hmm. We have the tide coming in and then the tide going out, and that washes everything away.
Mm. It sounds very healing, Sam. I mean, I'm just like,
Well, I mean, so does, some measure of purposeful or meaningful erosion, right? That can be.
yeah.
Thank God for that, like that skin comes off rather than it just stays on us, right?
Oh my God. Can you imagine what we look like if we never shed?
Right.
That
Just some
would be a sight. That
crusty
would be
motherfuckers,
it'd be crusty. Oh my gosh. This was what a talk. What a talk on Saturn and Pisces. So, Sam, where can people find you? What do you got going on?
So
Let us
people can
know.
find me at unlockastrology.com, and they can find me on Twitter, where I sometimes tweet a lot, at Unlock Astrology. And then they can find me on Instagram under S as in Sam, F as in Fred, Reynolds. So SF Reynolds, all one word, on Instagram. And in terms of what I have coming up, I think I may be dark for a good portion of March. I'm going to be doing stuff with Astrology Hub. I may be starting another class. Well, I plan on starting another class on learning to construct charts by hand. Um, so that's nitty-gritty 4. And that probably will be like an intensive, rather than over a set number of weeks as I normally do classes. Because I got a lot coming up, including NORWAC in May on Labor Day weekend. So looking forward to. Are you coming to NORWAC this year? No.
I'm not. I contemplated it, but decided against it. But I know it's gonna be fun. So
It is
hopefully
gonna be
listeners out
fun
there.
getting the crew together, and then I'm flying up to Edmonton to do a workshop on 2 things. Well, one is going to be on talking about the finding your lot of spirit, but really it's going to be like a whole long workshop on the daemon in
Mm,
astrology, the daemonic.
the
And I don't mean
demo.
demon. I don't want people being like, "What kind of Muslim is he?" Talking about demons. I'm not talking about demons. It's the daemonic. More your inner spirit. Put it that way.
And so that's gonna be in person. That's not an
That
online
is going to be
thing.
in person also that's going to be in Edmonton, Alberta. Up in
Mm,
Canada.
up in Canada. So if you're in Canada,
If you're in
go
Canada.
go check that out.
Yeah. And it's
So
um Edmonton. I should know this.
I'm
Sometimes
like, do I know where Edmonton is? I'm trying to do my Canadian geography, which is
yeah,
very
if you do a search for the astrologyedmonton.com, you will find me on the website there, and from there you could, find it under events. And yeah, so I'll be there in June. Let me see. I think they have me up there. Last I checked, I thought I was up there. Um, so
well, it's good you're dark for a little bit to catch up because it sounds like you're gonna be busy.
I've been, yeah, I have been busy.
What's
Yeah.
your NORWAC talk gonna be on? Or
What's the Fredaria?
oh, okay.
What the Fredaria? Yes,
What the Fedaria? What the Fedaria is that?
there you go.
Oh, well, definitely go check out Sam if you're at NORWAC or wherever. Or,
Yeah, I was gonna say people might be like, what's he talking about? So Fredaria is a time lord system. It's a system of for prediction. I gotta even clarify when I say time lord, it's like you have a TARDIS, Fredaria. Is it are we gonna be like Doctor Who?
who? Yeah, the Doctor Who.
But no. So thank you.
All right. Well, you can also find Sam. I'll make sure I always do a blog post for all our guests. So you come on over to energeticprinciples.com and there will be one for Sam as well. And I'll share the links for his website and NORWAC and other such things. You can also find me on, well, you can kind of find me on social media. And I say this every podcast. My social media is dying. It's like it's taking its last it's like grasping for air. It's like, post, Mel, just post. And I'm like, I don't want to. But if I do post, you'll find me at Energetic Principles. But right now I have an occasional story or something like that. But kind of feeling that wave of like, I don't know, we'll see what Pluto and Aquarius, how this whole social media
Do
thing
you have a
goes.
Twitter? No?
No, I'm not a tweet. I'm not a tweet bird. I
You
have a
an
Twitter,
Instagram?
but I have an Instagram. That's
Mhm.
where I talk the most is the old Instawebs. Instagram. But yeah, I think my platform these days is this podcast. It's like, if you want to hear me, come to the podcast because it's all there. It always shows up. And it's got all the meaty hooks right there. And of course the website where you can book a consultation with yours truly. And you do personal consultations as well, right,
I
Sam? Do you have
do.
time
Yeah.
for that?
I do. I mean, although right now I'm booking for April and May.
All right. Well, those are potent periods, so get in there while you can.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, if you are listening to anywhere you're listening to this, if you could leave a review, it will help the podcast be seen. Or if you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear what you think about Saturn in Pisces and some of the things that we talked about today and what you might think there. Or if you have any additions, what we haven't talked about, and you're
Yeah,
like, I
please.
think I'm going to see this. I want to hear that. Let that imagination speak, give it form so we can hear what you're thinking about Saturn and Pisces. So all right. Well, Sam, it was such a pleasure talking with you here today. I'm so happy that you graced me on the podcast with your presence. I really appreciate your
Same
time.
here. Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you for tuning in to us talk all about Saturn and Pisces. We wish you well on the start of this ingress. And as always, may the stars be with you.